The greatest Cleveland Browns players of all time, the top 10. Today we look at who those players are that made up the historic Cleveland Browns franchise that has not been so winning and not nearly as dominant as they used to be over the last 3 decades. They have, of course, been one of the bottom feeders of the NFL. They are also the team that inspired the name of our YouTube channel, the Winning Browns Podcast, obviously being a play on words. Um, but at number 10, we'll start off with Marion Motley, one of the players who highlighted that dominant dynasty era of the Cleveland Browns in the late 40s and the early 50s. Four-time AAFC champ, one-time NFL champ. Two times he led the league in rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. Those years also being the two times he was a first team All Pro selection, member of the 1940s All Decade team. Kind of odd seeing a running back, technically a fullback, wearing the number 76, but Motley was extremely impactful for the Browns franchise history. At number 9, we're going to go with Frank Gatsky, center and linebacker, played both sides of the football, three-time first-team All-Pro selection, four-time AAFC champion, four-time NFL champion, and a key reason to why the guy before him, Marion Motley, was able to run so well in the late 40s and early 50s. The anchor of what was a great offensive line and one of the first few guys who called his own plays off of that offensive line, things you see out of guys like Jason Kelsey nowadays. You saw it in Jeff Saturday when he was with the Colts with Peyton Manning. Frank Gatsky was one of the godfathers of that type of play. At number 8, we're going to go with another guy who changed his position forever. That would be Ozzie Newsome. We talk a lot about Kellen Winslow and how he changed the game as far as being a receiving threat. Ozzie Newsome was right up there with him in the 1980s as one of the best tight ends in the league, one of the best players for a Browns team that constantly got their hearts broken by, of course, the Denver Broncos and John Elway. But had it not been for him, we wouldn't have had guys like Shannon Sharp or Travis Kelsey or Tony Gonzalez who are putting up these ridiculous receiving numbers. He's actually very similar to them in that same stance, being that he wasn't a great blocker, especially a guy like Travis Kelsey. But of course, had two 1,000 yard seasons, kind of opening up what a tight end can do as far as that position goes. At number 7, we're going to go with Dick Shafrath, tackle for the Browns in the early 1960s, three-time first-team All-Pro selection, just an absolute mammoth of a being. Just could get his hands on you and just anchor you down. There was nothing you could do about it. Certainly one of the great tackles of the pre-Super Bowl era. At number 6, we're going to go with Myles Garrett, a guy who's already made a name for himself as one of the greatest Cleveland Browns players of all time. Is it too early? Not at all. He's a four-time first-team All-Pro selection in just 8 seasons with Cleveland. Former Defensive Player of the Year. Would have been 2, in my opinion, had it not been for the fact that he got suspended in 2019 for, of course, the whole incident with Mason Rudolph and the helmet. But has led the league in sacks and, one of the most dominant defensive players in the late 2010s and the early 2020s. I find it kind of ironic or kind of coincidental that, not coincidental, I find it quite fitting that I'm making this video right after Myles Garrett just recently requested a trade from the Browns. We'll see if he stays with the Browns, but he already has 102 and a half sacks in his career. That speaks for itself. He is one of the greatest Browns of all time, comes in at number 6. At number 5, we're going to go with the guy who succeeded the greatest player in Browns history. We'll get to that guy later on, and adds to a rich history of Browns running backs. They've had a lot of great running backs. That would be none other than Leroy Kelly. Led the league in rushing 3 times, led the league in rushing touchdowns 3 times. Was a pretty good receiver for a time where the Browns, where running backs just didn't get the ball a lot in the passing game. And the passing game was just very underdeveloped as it is. But Leroy Kelly was one of the greatest players in Browns history. He comes in at number 5. At number 4, we're going to go with a guy who played 22 seasons in the NFL, and he looks kind of big to play 22 seasons. You'd think he'd play offensive line, and yes, he did, but he also played multiple positions, left tackle, right tackle, and wait till you hear this, kicker. Yeah, and the guy who you probably know as the guy who is awarded the best kicker award in college football. That would be Lou Groza Award. Um, he led the league in kicks made 6 times in his career, was a 14-time first team All Pro selection, member of the All 50s decade team, um, and was a 4-time AAFC champ as well as 4-time NFL champ. One of the highlights of that Browns team. I would love to see what a guy like Lou Groza would look like in modern day NFL. Just one of the most interesting and unique players of all time. When was the last time you heard of an offensive lineman who was also one of the best kickers in the league? Lou Groza comes in at number 4. At number 3, we're going to go with 6-time first-team All-Pro selection Joe Thomas, one of the most dominant tackles of the 2010s. It's a shame his career got wasted behind a really, really, really bad Browns team. But he was easily the best player on that team, and easily one of the best tackles and the highlight on what was otherwise a very forgettable era of Browns football. Joe Thomas comes in at number 3. At number 2, we're going to go with Otto Graham, a man who led the league in passing yards 3 times in his career, 5 times in his career. 7 times he was a first-team All-Pro selection. 3 times a UPI MVP. NFL had an MVP award at that time. I think he would have been 4 or 5 times. One of the greatest passers, deep ball passer in the history of the game. Finished his career with 9 yards per attempt, whopping. That is the second most all-time of any player in the history of the league to finish off their career, and is one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, and was the highlight of a dominant Browns offense that won as many times as they did during the late 40s and the early 50s. 4-time AAFC champion and 4-time NFL champion, like some of the other players I mentioned. He comes in at number 2. But at number 1, there's no doubt about it. It's going to be Jim Brown. Technically a fullback, but arguably the greatest running back of all time. Certainly the greatest fullback if you want to go with that. Led the league in rushing yards and touchdowns every year of his career except for one. That would be his 1963 season. Is one of the greatest seasons in NFL history. Of course, he had 1,800 yards at that time, which was still a lot for that time. 3-time NFL MVP. We're talking about a guy who led the Browns to several championships. Larger than life as far as football goes, impactful beyond the game as far as what he did to help civil rights and whatnot. So just kind of the face of the franchise in the history of what the Browns have had. For a team that has had a lot of good running backs, he certainly stands out among the bunch. Jim Brown is the greatest Cleveland Brown of all time. Not the guy named the Browns name their franchise. That, of course, would be Coach Paul Brown, no relation. But Jim Brown, I mean, for what it's worth, people talk about, oh, he played at a era where players weren't as good or whatnot. I guarantee you, I for anyone who says that, not many people say that, but I request you to look at NFL tape. Just look at Jim Brown. Most running backs during that time, they would win by just outrunning their opponent or being a benefactor of really good blocking. Jim Brown was one of the very few running backs who would just break every tackle in front of him. I don't think I've seen a guy break as many tackles on every play as Jim Brown did. He would survive in any era, and there's no doubt about it. Extremely strong for his size. But Jim Brown certainly, easily, is the greatest Cleveland Brown of all time.